Why do you think the middle class is usually persistently unhappy whenever the budget is presented?
There is no doubt that we need to create more jobs, but just because there is an emphasis on employment and job creation does not mean, in a binary manner that jobs are not being created.
The allocation of the education budget has gradually reduced.
In education, it is not about the budget. Here, governance matters a lot, and this is an area that states need to play the most important role. It is a small farmer that is actually getting hurt through the status quo. Over 90% of that stock of emissions actually is contributed by the advanced economies.
Welcome to our show, Badi Badi Baatein. Congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
There's a lot of talk about India at 100. I mean, the government talks about it, the opposition talks about it, the political financial dispensation talks about it. What is your take on India at 75? Where are we today economically?
We're the fifth largest economy. Among all the large economies, we're growing at the fastest. We grew out of COVID by implementing very good policies both on the health and the economic side. Poverty has reduced significantly over the last 10 years. If you look at using the latest consumption survey, if you look at employment as well, and this is one area where oftentimes the negative narratives have run ahead of the actual data. But if you look at the data using the very high quality CLEMS database, which by the way is an international database, from the vantage point that I occupy at the International Monetary Fund, I can vouch for that. So I think India is doing very well both from a macro perspective of growth, but at the same time also generating inclusive growth.
Why do you think then the youth is not happy about the employment situation in the country?
I don't know what data or evidence you're pointing out to support that claim. I go by the data that economists use when you look at, and I just pointed that data out to you. So the basis of your question, I would like to know what is the evidence that you have to make that claim.
Well, it's the experiences we have as journalists from the ground while speaking to the youth of the country.
As I said earlier as well, I think this is one area where the narrative using poor quality data has run ahead. And it can happen actually where, when some of the narratives, let's say, are pushed, then people can believe these narratives without, looking at the high quality data.
Why do you think the middle class is usually persistently unhappy whenever the budget is presented? Do you think there is a scope to do more for the middle class while the government is taking care of the poor and the business class?
I have focused on the need for social and economic inclusion, which will lead to the creation of a large middle class. And I've emphasized that jobs are really critical. There is no doubt that we need to create more jobs. That is because we are a young population. But just because there is an emphasis on employment and job creation does not mean, in a binary manner that jobs are not being created.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's important to keep in mind. I think some of the policies that have been implemented in the last decade need to be redoubled. I think the emphasis on manufacturing is really critical, and that's why in the book I spend a significant amount of space talking about the need for manufacturing, because manufacturing sector creates jobs, and keep in mind that as the middle class grows, as the economy grows as well, middle class will require all kinds of durable goods, whether it's a refrigerator, whether it's a two-wheeler or an air conditioner, and if we do not have enough manufacturing happening in India, we'll have to import all of that. That will lead to trade deficit, current account deficit, etc., etc. And so the importance of manufacturing, importance of agriculture, growth in that as well for a large middle class and an aspirational middle class to be created is something that is important.
When we talk about India at 100, there are certain steps that are already being taken. Like if you take the recent budget, the government aims to create approximately 4.1 crore jobs in the next 5 years. And to support this, they have 2 lakh crores rupees allocated But do you think there could be certain practical challenges to the implementation of these initiatives?
So let me use the evidence of similar programs that have done very well. Let's go back to the COVID period when the Atmanirbhar Bharat Rozgar Yojana was implemented, where firms with less than 1,000 employees were given the subsidy, where the 12% contribution of the employer provident contribution was taken care of by the government. And that the evidence, actually SBI research and others have shown that has led to significant job creation. Why? Because as we economists think about if you have to have impact, real impact through policy, that policy has to relax what is a binding constraint. And in the case of employment, oftentimes that binding constraint is from the employer's side, is also from the skilling side. If for instance the employer does not find the employee to be skilled enough, that becomes a binding constraint. Or if the employer actually thinks that he doesn't have the requirement for that particular job, let's say, then that becomes a binding constraint as well. So focusing on skilling and giving incentives to employers help in relaxing these binding constraints, and that is why they actually delivered the good outcomes that they did. So when you look at the recent policies that have been implemented, these are based on things that have already worked. Therefore that gives me optimism that they should be able to that they should work going forward as well.
Another aspect that would aid the growth and employment and eventually skillful jobs is education.
Yeah.
You have spoken about the need to pushing more education and pushing more quality education in your book.
Yeah.
But there is, because you spoke about narratives, there is a particular narrative going on for the past 1 week, which everybody is pointing at, is that the allocation of the education budget over the past, say, 20 years, in all the 4 subsequent governments, each budget has gradually reduced in proportion to the total budget that is presented. How do you look at this data point that is being talked about?
So let me respond to this question by comparing with healthcare, because there's also a chapter on healthcare in the, if this healthcare spend increases from 1% of GDP, state and center together, to about 2.5% of GDP, and this is one of the first charts in that healthcare chapter, the reduction in out-of-pocket spending by households can be significant, can actually go down by about half. I'm sure all of us remember the movie 3 Idiots, where the 3 characters go to Raju's house, and Raju's mother talks about how almost half of her income goes into taking care of the ailing father, which is oftentimes a situation that many poor households face. So increasing the allocation, and especially states need to do this. It's really critical in healthcare. But, and this is why the contrast to healthcare is important, in education it is not about the budget. The emphasis should not be as much amount on the budget as it should be on ensuring that the bang for the buck is actually increased significantly. And here governance matters a lot, and this is an area that states need to play the most important role. The way teachers actually are sort of pulling out teachers to do riff-raff jobs, all that basically does not help with generating bang for the buck on the educational rupee that is spent. The importance of pedagogical methods and good training material, good teaching material cannot be overemphasized. The same teacher, when actually is given better quality teaching material, can deliver much better teaching. In other words, the emphasis on education needs to be on generating greater bang for the buck, which really where the onus has to be much more on state governments. In other words, I will turn your question 180 degrees and say that the entire emphasis on education needs to be on states to ensure that governance in the education sector, ensure that that teachers' utilization, the teaching material creation, all these are emphasized. I don't think it is the budget that is actually the problem in education. It is the utilization of that budget.
Coming to agriculture, you've spoken about how small farmers need to become the labharthis of maximum of whatever is the economic condition of the country.
Yeah.
To achieve that in the next 25 years, what more do you suggest needs to be done?
First and foremost, the emphasis on and the realization that it is a small farmer that is actually getting hurt through the status quo. Because of the way in which the status quo has been, if you take the APMC Act, the farmer is forced to go and sell in a particular mandi. Many times what happens, a small farmer who does not have his own tractor trailer, or maybe doesn't, what he does is he actually will hire a tractor trailer to actually bring his produce to the local mandi. That the intermediary there, who's actually typically is called the arhatiya, knows very well that this small farmer has nobody else to go. So the small farmer basically waits from 8 o'clock in the morning or maybe 7 o'clock to actually sell his produce. The intermediary makes him wait for maybe 3:30, 4. By that time, the produce itself actually is sort of reducing in quality, and at the same time, that small farmer is becoming desperate. And using that, then the price that the small farmer gets is much lower, and this is actually seen in the data as well. If you look at the value added between the small farmer and the intermediary of 100 rupees, that value added, about 90 of that actually goes to the intermediary. The small farmer does not get adequately at all. Second aspect, take the Essential Commodities Act. It's a fundamental aspect of agriculture that supply is seasonal, demand is all through the year. Supply comes during the cropping season. When you have supply that is seasonal and demand that is all through the year, what do you have to do? Of course, you have to store. And yet, through the Essential Commodities Act that was enacted in the 1960s, when India had food shortage, we effectively equate all storage to hoarding. And I'm sure you remember, if you're young, you may not remember, but your dad may actually remind you of Bollywood movies where Jeevan was basically, if he was storing, he was shown as a hoarder.
Yeah.
Every person who stores. But it's a fundamental aspect. When you have supply that is seasonal and demand that is all through the year, you have to store. But through the Essential Commodities Act and the penalties therein, we actually have disincentivized storage completely. Large farmers can build they have the deep pockets to go and build the storage to utilize storage. The small farmer suffers. The current status quo actually hurts really the small farmers. We've really sort of held back the agricultural sector through these very, very archaic regulation that only ends up benefiting the existing rich farmers and the intermediaries.
One of the most interesting points in your book is something which you have raised, and something which we have been shouting off of our rooftops for a very long time, that countries like India, developing nations, are having to bear the brunt of climate change more than the developed nations. Could you tell our viewers how exactly are we getting affected economically?
Firstly, if we look at climate change that is caused by the stock of emissions, not the flow of emissions, and to explain to our viewers, think about water in a tank and water flowing in. The amount of water that flows in maybe a minute or maybe half an hour, that's the amount of flow. But the level of the water is basically the stock. So when you think about climate change, it is the stock of emissions. Think about that tank of all the GHG emissions, the level. It's that level that has actually led to all these symptoms of climate change. And who has contributed to that level? Actually data is very clear that over 90% of that stock of emissions actually is contributed by the advanced economies. At the same time, actually, there's research by Nobel laureate Esther Duflo at MIT showing that even if you look at the production, today's production that actually, let's say, that happens in India or China, Vietnam, Thailand, etc., a lot of the production is happening still for consumption by advanced economies. So in other words, even the current consumption and the flow of emissions that are being created are basically being outsourced to emerging economies. These are aspects that really need to be part of the conversations on climate change. But in emerging economies, social safety nets are also not as strong as it is in the advanced economies. It needs to be a more fair conversation, on climate change and not just a conversation of convenience.
Thank you so much for joining us on the Quint, and thank you so much for joining me on Badi Badi Baatein. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.